Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're diving deep into this really cool text about major shifts in 20th century world history. And got to keep our UPSC aspirants in mind, right? So this one's especially for you guys, focusing on those big international relations topics, the end of empires and the rise and fall of the Cold War. I mean,
hmm
these are huge, huge shifts that shape the world we live in today. And understanding them, that's key for any UPSC aspirant, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. These are like watershed moments, no doubt. And what's really fascinating is how they're all interconnected. It's like how the dismantling of all these empires kind of set the stage for that whole Cold War rivalry. And then both of those things, they continue to like influence global politics even today. It's crazy.
It really is. Our source, it points to 1945 as a super pivotal year. And yeah, obviously it was the end of World War II. But it also triggered something else, something equally monumental, decolonization.
Oh.
Empires that had been around for centuries, they just started to crumble. Think about it. The British Empire alone, at its peak, it ruled over like a quarter of the world's population.
It's mind-blowing, right? And this whole dismantling of empires, it wasn't just about like redrawing some lines on a map. It led to this cascade of changes, this of the birth of all these new nations, tons of new members in the UN, and this mad scramble for influence among the superpowers. Think about what that means for international relations. Suddenly you have all these new players on the global stage, each with their own interests and agendas and everything. It's a lot.
Right, yeah, totally. And the text, it mentions three main factors that fueled this wave of decolonization. So first, it talks about imperial overreach. Basically, the old imperial powers, like Britain and France, they were stretched too thin. Their resources were totally depleted after the war.
Exactly. They just couldn't maintain these massive empires anymore. And then on top of that, you have the second factor, the rise of the US as this dominant force. America, they really pushed for getting rid of empires, something that a weakened Europe just couldn't really resist.
And then, of course, you can't forget about the people themselves, right? I mean, come on, this is like the third and maybe the most important factor. You had all these nationalist movements, often inspired by things like Marxism-Leninism, and they fiercely resisted colonial rule. It was a fight for independence, but also for economic and social change.
Oh, absolutely. These movements, they tapped into this deep desire for self-determination. They challenged the very foundation of colonial power. And, they had varying degrees of success. And this brings us to another important point. Decolonization, it wasn't like this uniform process. The text highlights contrasting approaches. You had Britain kind of like accepting the inevitable, while France, they clung to their colonies. And that led to some really brutal conflicts, like the wars in Vietnam and Algeria.
Right, yeah. So for someone studying international relations, especially with the UPSC exam coming up, what's the takeaway here? What's the significance of these different approaches? What do you think?
That's a great question. I think the best way to think about it is these contrasting approaches had real long-term consequences. For example, with Britain accepting things, they generally saw more peaceful transitions to independence. But then you look at France and their resistance, well, that led to these long and violent struggles, and in turn, that shaped those countries' paths after colonialism.
Oh, I see, I see. So understanding these nuances is really important. And speaking of nuances, the text also mentions how the economic outcomes of decolonization varied widely. Some former colonies, like the tiger economies in East Asia, they thrived, while others, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, struggled with poverty and underdevelopment.
Yeah, it's a super complex situation, and it shows how decolonization wasn't some magic solution for development. You have factors like existing inequalities, Cold War interference, internal political dynamics, all of that played a role in these different outcomes.
Makes you think about how these big global shifts impacted individual nations, right? Like India's journey to independence, that had to be a huge moment, not just for India, but for the whole world. So how do you see decolonization shaping India's place on the global stage?
Oh, that's a crucial point, especially for our UPSC listeners. India gaining independence in 47, that was a major turning point. It marked a huge shift in the dismantling of the British Empire and signaled this rising tide of decolonization across the globe. But it also set the stage for India's unique role in the Cold War.
A unique role, what do you mean by that?
Well, India decided to go with non-alignment. They refused to get caught up in that binary conflict between the US and USSR. This approach, which was influenced by their experience with colonialism, it let India carve out its own space in international relations. They advocated for a multipolar world, and they championed the interests of all those newly independent nations.
Wow, that's really interesting. It just goes to show how understanding the history of decolonization can shed light on a country's foreign policy choices.
Absolutely. Now, let's switch gears a bit and talk about the other major force of the 20th century, the Cold War. After World War II ended, the US and the USSR, they became superpowers. And they were locked in this rivalry, what the text calls bipolarity. It wasn't just about military power, though. It was this ideological battle between capitalism and communism, each side wanting to be the dominant force in the world.
And this rivalry, it played out all over the world, right? We see it in how Europe was divided by the Iron Curtain, and then there
Yeah.
was the formation of military alliances like NATO and the Warsaw Pact, plus all those proxy wars fought in far-off corners of the globe.
Exactly. The Cold War, it affected almost every aspect of international relations. It shaped alliances, it fueled conflicts, and it even influenced domestic politics all over the world. Its impact was huge.
Speaking of impact, our text dives into the different viewpoints on how the Cold War actually started. The traditional view puts the blame squarely on the Soviet Union, saying it was all about their expansionist ambitions and their desire to spread communism everywhere.
Yeah, that's the traditional view. But there are other perspectives, too. The revisionist view, for instance, it argues that the Soviets' actions were mostly defensive, like they were just responding to what they saw as a hostile West encroaching on their territory. They say the Soviets, after all the suffering they went through in World War II, were primarily focused on securing their borders and preventing another invasion. They didn't want to go through that again.
Wow, it's interesting how history can be interpreted so differently. And our text doesn't stop there. It also brings up these post-revisionist explanations, adding even more nuance to the whole thing.
Oh, for sure. Post-revisionists, they go beyond pointing fingers at one side or the other. They look at the structural factors and the miscalculations that contributed to the Cold War. For example, they might argue that because there wasn't a clear global leader after World War II, it created this power vacuum that both the US and USSR tried to fill, which led to competition and mistrust. It was bound to happen.
So it wasn't all about ideology then. It was also about power dynamics and geopolitics.
Exactly. And post-revisionists, they also emphasize how misperceptions and missed opportunities for cooperation played a role. They argue that both sides, weighed down by their ideologies and past baggage, they often misunderstood each other's actions. And that led to a spiral of suspicion and hostility. It just kept escalating.
It's amazing how these different perspectives can change our understanding of such a huge event. And it brings up a big question for our listeners, especially those preparing for the UPSC. How much blame can we actually place on ideology versus just pure power politics when it comes to the Cold War's origins? It's something to really think about as you study.
Yeah, it's a super important point, and it highlights just how complex historical analysis really is. It's not always about finding like one right answer. It's more about understanding all the different factors that kind of come together to create these big changes.
You got it. And the Cold War itself, it wasn't just this one static thing. It went through these distinct phases, each with its own, characteristics and challenges and stuff. Right, exactly. And the text outlines those phases. So you have the early Cold War in Europe, roughly from 1945, like 1962. This was when the East-West divide became really solid, like that Iron Curtain image. And then there was the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, and obviously those rival military alliances forming NATO versus the Warsaw Pact.
Yeah, it was a time of some serious ideological clashes and geopolitical maneuvering, for sure. Europe basically became the main battleground, with both sides wanting more influence and control, trying to secure their sphere.
And it wasn't just contained to Europe, was it? I mean, the text talks about how the Cold War went global. And the Korean War, that was a big turning point.
Right, absolutely. The Korean War, which started in 1950, that was the first major proxy war of the Cold War. It showed how this rivalry between the superpowers could spark conflicts in completely different parts of the world. It drew in other countries, and it escalated tensions globally.
And then, obviously, there's the Cuban Missile Crisis in '62, which I think a lot of people consider the closest the world has ever come to a full-blown nuclear war.
Yeah.
It's kind of scary to think about how high the stakes were back then.
Yeah, it's definitely sobering. The Cuban Missile Crisis brought us to the brink of, well, annihilation, basically. And it really highlights the potential consequences of Cold War brinkmanship. Anyone studying international relations, especially those gearing up for the UPSC, they got to understand what led to this crisis and the lessons we learned from it.
Oh, totally. It's like a textbook case study in crisis diplomacy and miscalculation and just how important clear communication is, to avoid things getting out of hand.
Exactly. But it's important to remember that the Cold War wasn't always just confrontation. There were periods of less tension, too, like the Détente era in the 70s. During that time, the US and USSR actually tried to cooperate on some things. You had arms control agreements and cultural exchanges, that kind of stuff.
So like a little bit of hope in the middle of all this tension and uncertainty.
It was, yeah. But détente, it didn't last very long. By the 80s, the Cold War entered a new phase. A lot of people call it the Second Cold War. Reagan became president in the US, and he took a much stronger anti-communist stance. He ramped up military spending and basically focused on countering Soviet influence all over the world.
Right, right. And this was also when a lot of regional conflicts intensified, like the Soviet war in Afghanistan, which, made things even worse between the U.S. and the Soviets.
Yeah, and it's important to remember the impact of things like the Vietnam War, too. The Vietnam War, it wasn't a direct fight between the superpowers, but it became a symbol of the Cold War's devastating effects. And it fueled anti-war movements globally. It's really important to see how these types of events shaped public opinion and influenced the direction of the Cold War.
And then, pretty unexpectedly, the Cold War just ended. It was the late 80s, early 90s. This seemingly unbreakable division that had defined global politics for decades just crumbled. And it happened so fast, it left a lot of people wondering, what just happened? What caused this?
It's a question that still fascinates historians and political scientists. Our text points to a bunch of different factors, both internal and external, that sort of combined to end the Cold War. Internally, the Soviet Union was facing a ton of economic problems. Their centrally planned economy was just not working. It couldn't keep up with the West, especially when it came to technology and, actually meeting people's needs.
And on top of that economic stagnation, you also had growing unrest, socially and politically, right? People were increasingly unhappy with the lack of freedom and opportunity under Soviet rule.
Yeah, exactly. The whole Soviet system was losing its legitimacy. And then you had Gorbachev. His reforms, perestroika and glasnost, were supposed to revitalize the system. But these reforms, although they had good intentions, they kind of backfired. They created more space for people to disagree, and they emboldened the opposition. And in the end, they weakened the Communist Party's hold on power.
So you had all this internal pressure building, but the text also mentions the impact of external factors, right? Things like Reagan's policies and the pressures of globalization.
Exactly. Reagan's second Cold War approach, with all that military buildup and his tough talk, it put a lot of pressure on the Soviet Union. They had to try to keep up militarily, which just strained their economy even more. And at the same time, globalization was connecting the world in new ways, economically and culturally. And this highlighted the huge gap between the West and the Soviet bloc.
It's like the Soviet Union was caught in a vice between internal and external pressures.
That's a good way to put it. And this brings up a really important question that the text asks. Was the collapse of communism just inevitable, or was it caused by a specific set of events?
It's a big question, and historians are still debating it. But if you really want to understand the end of the Cold War and what it meant for the world, you have to understand how all these internal and external factors interacted.
Yeah, it really makes you think. And it just shows, how tricky it can be to analyze history. It's not always about finding a simple cause and effect. It's more about understanding how all these different forces kind of, come together to create these massive changes. Exactly. And this brings us back to those key takeaways for our listeners, especially those getting ready for the UPSC exam. Understanding the end of empires and the rise and fall of the Cold War, it's not about just memorizing dates and names, right? It's about getting a deeper grasp of those underlying forces that shaped global politics in the 20th century. And these things, they still matter today.
So it's not just history for the sake of history. We're talking about developing a deep understanding of the forces that have shaped the world we live in, right? The world that future diplomats and policymakers will have to navigate. It's a big deal.
Absolutely. Think about it this way. The end of all those empires led to, tons of new nations emerging, and each one had its own hopes and its own struggles. And that totally reshaped the global landscape. It created new chances for everyone to work together, but also new points of tension and conflict. And then the Cold War, with all its ideological battles and geopolitical maneuvering, that just made everything even more complicated.
So for our listeners, especially those UPSC aspirants, how should they approach this massive and complex history? What are some things they should keep in mind, do you think?
Well, the most important thing is to understand how interconnected everything is. Decolonization and the Cold War, they weren't just separate events. They were totally intertwined, each influencing the other. So when you're studying this stuff, try to see the connections, you know? How did the collapse of empires create these opportunities for Cold War rivalry? How did the Cold War, shape the way these newly independent nations developed?
It's like you're putting together a puzzle, right?
Yeah.
Trying to see how all the pieces fit to make the bigger picture.
Exactly. And don't just focus on the events themselves. Go deeper, Look at the root causes and the long-term consequences. Like, what were the lasting impacts of decolonization on different parts of the world? How did the Cold War change international institutions, global alliances, economic development? All of that.
So we need to think critically about the legacy of these events. How are they still shaping global politics and economics today? It's all connected.
Absolutely. And don't be afraid to question the usual narratives. Explore different perspectives on what happened. Consider how factors like ideology, economics, nationalism, all of that, how those things interacted and shaped the outcomes. Developing those critical thinking skills, that's key for success in the UPSC and just in life generally.
It's about going beyond just memorizing facts. It's about engaging with history in a way that helps us make sense of the present and, maybe even anticipate future challenges.
Exactly. Now, before we wrap things up, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought to think about.
Okay, yeah. Give us something to chew on as they continue their UPSC prep.
So our text, it focuses mainly on the political and economic aspects of decolonization and the Cold War. But what about the social and cultural impacts? How did these events change identities, ideas, cultural expressions around the world? How did they influence art, literature, music, even daily life?
That's a really good point. It reminds us that history isn't just about these, abstract forces and big narratives. It's about how these forces affect the lives and experiences of real people.
Mm.
It's about the stories they tell, the art they create, how they understand the world around them.
Exactly. So as you delve deeper into your studies, remember to think about these broader social and cultural aspects too. It'll make your understanding of these historical shifts and their lasting effects much richer, much more meaningful.
It's a great reminder that history isn't this dead thing,
Huh?
It's a living, breathing thing that continues to shape who we are and how we see the world. So to all our listeners out there, especially those tackling the UPSC, keep exploring, keep questioning, keep making connections. And hey, who knows, maybe you'll even uncover some insights that our text didn't touch on.
Yeah. That's what's so great about learning, right? There's always something new to discover. And as you continue on your journey, don't forget to like and subscribe to The Deep Dive. We've got more deep dives coming up on all kinds of fascinating topics, and we'll help you expand your knowledge and get ready for that UPSC exam.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone. And until next time, stay curious.